Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is your program bringing you exciting news, updates, evaluations, discussion and analysis of religious liberty events in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed and I'm editor of Liberty Magazine, a magazine of over 100 years dealing with religious liberty from a separation of church and state point of view. My guest on the program is attorney John Ashmeade. And for our viewers' benefit, I'll explain your job. It's a long title,
sure.
And very important. You are the Associate Director for the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department of the Seventh Adventist Church on the Eastern Seaboard, basically the United States.
For the Atlantic Union.
We call it the Atlantic Union,
yes.
But that's an inside church designation.
Sure.
But you mostly are dealing with non-Adventists and a generalized religious liberty approach,
sure,
by definition.
Right.
There's a lot of things I can talk with you. We've spoken privately about different things, but let's just sort of cherry pick what's happening in the US right now. It's a very dynamic situation.
Right.
I can start with something that the religious groups have seized on for decades now, the abortion or anti-abortion movement. How do you see that playing into religious liberty or religious prerogatives generally?
Sure. I see a situation where you have Protestants and Catholics working very closely together on this issue. And as you know, they are a significant political bloc in this country.
Sure.
But the state of the law right now doesn't support their position. And, the state of the law has been in place for quite some time. Abortion, there's a constitutional right to abortion. And, religious folks...
The courts have said that, because
the courts have said that, but religious folks have been fighting that for quite some time.
Now, what's the constitutional right? Explain it as a lawyer. What is the right?
There is a right of privacy. I think it all stems from that right of privacy. And, the courts have said that we don't want to be in people's bedrooms. There's a certain zone that we want to give them of privacy, and I think the abortion falls within that from the perspective of the courts, and they've interpreted the Constitution to mean that. And so the question is, despite this major political bloc and the power wielded by Christians in this country, their point of view still has not come to dominate. And I think this is a testament to the Constitution and the separation of powers and the fact that, the majority can want something and the court can step in and say, you know what, we're going to protect the rights of the minority. Yeah. And so I think in a sense, while as a church we don't necessarily support abortion on demand, the issue really is the courts stepping in as a check on the will of the majority. And I think in that sense, that is a positive for religious liberty.
Yeah, I can see it that way. Of course, from the point of many of the religious anti-abortion activists, the court overstepped its bounds and legislated from the bench.
Right.
So you don't accept that. You think they really found that right in the Constitution. Now, there's another contention carried forward certainly by the Christian groups against gay rights. And I remember the court essentially authorized, its final authorization of gay behavior came on that same reasoning. It was Lawrence v. Kansas, wasn't it? Where the gays were charged with indecent acts in the home and that, but it devolved down, the court backed off and said they had a right to privacy. Right. And that just sort of, everything followed from that.
And I look at that issue a little bit different. For me, the real crux of the matter goes back to a decision by Justice Scalia. And where he sort of changed the dynamic in terms of protecting religious freedom. And he said, as long as there is a general law out there, the Smith case, as long as there's a general law, as long as there is a general law that is not targeting religion, you don't have to provide that strict, review of it
and
that the courts normally would do.
Most of us working on religious liberty think that was a horrible case.
It's the worst case of all time, in my view.
And I've never heard anyone say it, but you know what my take on that is?
Right.
It was a further ignoring of the rights and prerogatives and humanity of Native Americans.
Right, right.
It was easy to sweep away their religious practices because it was, a sweat lodge. I don't know if it was a sweat lodge type ceremony of a marginal group that we sort of chased out of a common converse into the Badlands, basically.
And I think it reflected, the view that, I'm going to protect the majority and not be as concerned with a minority faith. But to me, the heart of religious liberty and freedom is being able to protect the minority from the majority whims. And I think that decision reflects that point of view, where it was sort of short-sighted. He never foresaw a situation where the majority Christian group would, face, a situation where their religious freedoms wouldn't be protected. And I think this is what happens now in a situation where, with the recent decision, there are no protections in place for Christians who have objections. And I think that was a mistake by Scalia.
Yeah. Well, there's no question that Christian groups in the U.S., at least the politically active ones, have this sense of persecution. In fact, there was a book written by the guy that the brother that wrote the Book of Virtues.
Bennett?
Bennett. His brother wrote a book, something about the lion in the lion's den type thing. And the whole book, I read it a few years ago, and the whole thing was that Christians are a persecuted minority in the US. I think there's an element of truth in it, but it's turning the world upside down. The fact remains that of all the Western countries, the US is the most Christian, the most religiously active, and in many ways most puritanical in its some of the aspects of society. As I've told people privately, go to the beach, and you'll see in an instant that we're still puritanical. Hollywood aside, it's a perverse center of cultural meltdown, there's no question. But the U.S. is prudish compared to much of the Western world.
Here's what I'll say. I think Christian minorities face some challenges in this country. The majority, the legislatures aren't going
playing
to.
Into my,
but they're not going. They're not going to pass laws that affect the majority of Christians. But they will, pass laws that will prevent, a small minority group from coming into neighborhoods and passing out leaflets and those kinds of things.
And what we're seeing now, clearly in the U.S., there's an unprecedented alliance between a faction that's broadly representative of Christian Catholics and Protestants. They sort of have the inside track to political, if not political power, then the ear of the power brokers. So they've come into their rights. So I don't see them as being disenfranchised at all. And I think the source of their frustration is precisely what goes with that. They've been used to getting what they want societally without even a fight. So the abortion thing particularly frustrates them because it's, again, you and I both know that the laws notwithstanding, you get further out from the cities and the little country areas, they often quietly have prayer even in the public schools. The ministers come in and have Bible class. It's not supposed to be allowed on the current interpretations of separation of church and state, but culturally that's the expectation. So when that stopped, whoa, freedom's gone. But it was never right. It just was their want to do that.
I think what stands in their way in the majority of instances is the First Amendment and how it's interpreted. And so we have seen in the recent years a willingness to put judges on the courts, both the appellate and district and as well as Supreme Court, who will interpret the Constitution in a way that will allow for more religion in the public square than we've been used to. And that is something to continue to watch and to be concerned with.
Yeah, okay. Well, you introduced something that nobody else on this program ever has. They've changed the discussion of the court's activity from the Supreme Court to the lower court, and I think it's a whole different story. But you actually said something that I don't agree with.
Okay.
We know that on the Supreme Court there's a openly stated and belligerent attempt to stack the deck.
Sure.
And I just don't think it works in their favor. There's any number of examples of someone put in by a faction. When they're there, they're either far more moderate than they expect, or in some cases they appear to be taking the opposite view.
Sure.
But at the lower courts, my take is that it's increasingly dominated by secularists with antagonism to religion.
Sure.
They haven't been able to stack it, have they?
Sure. I think it goes back and forth between administrations. When you have a Democratic administration in, you get a number of judges put into the system that reflect that point of view. And I think when you have a Republican administration, you get a number of conservative judges put on these courts.
Well, yes, but where's the evidence that
and keep in mind that the vast majority of cases are not accepted by the Supreme Court. And so the real Supreme Court are those appellate judges around the country. And so if these judges are vetted and everyone knows their political leanings. Yeah. And so if you put in a number of judges with a certain political leaning, you're going to get the outcome that you're looking for. Yeah. And I think that does happen.
But so you see evidence of conservative judges at the lower level?
I see that. I mean, I think these judges make decisions that are business friendly. They make decisions.
In that sense, yes.
Right. In that sense.
But on conservative on morality and religious prerogatives. I
right. Well, even if we're dealing with a business issue, morality comes into play. And in the sense of you're taking the side of big business or you're protecting the consumer. And you see those kinds of decisions coming into play, and that does have an impact. Yeah. And over time, it makes people very weary and worried about the government, and it makes people worried about big business and how that's impacting their lives. Yeah. And that can have a long-term effect where they're looking for someone who will come forward and say, I'm going to protect you, follow me, believe in me, and I'm going to fight big business, I'm going to fight big government. And then you start to see power being centralized in ways that are troubling.
Correct. There is an inordinate effort to stack the deck. Mm-hmm. It's always been there, but I think more than usual. I just haven't seen the evidence on the lower courts that's right-wing stacked, but it probably is in ways I haven't seen it, because you can't have it noticeable only on one level and no effect on the other. But I haven't seen the lower.
Right.
We need to take a break. And we'll be back to continue this discussion. And I hope I don't disagree with my guest too much.
That's quite okay, Lincoln.
But that's why we want you to watch. These things are not as cut and dried as you might think. And they all demand a certain analysis. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break with guest John Ashmeade, I was testing his opinions more than opinions, his knowledge on the dynamic of the courts being stacked and conservative and liberal judges and so on. And you started the program, as I remember, mentioning Justice Scalia.
Right.
And on one level, he might not be missed. He was one of the Cold War right-wing warriors of the court. Sure. But I heard him a couple of times. He was fascinating to the extreme. Mm-hmm. And he certainly was the type that would stack the deck. But how have things changed in your view since he left? His leaving really changed things. For example, Thomas for the first time spoke. Remember?
Right.
They were fellow travelers, but Justice Thomas never spoke that I know of on the court. But he spoke within days of Scalia leaving.
Right. I think that Scalia was a brilliant jurist. I don't necessarily agree with all of his opinions. I think that he wrote the worst decision for religious liberty of all times, in that Smith decision. But that said, he had a real sense of how he viewed the world, and certainly had the intellect and the writing skills and the ability to, put pen to paper and to get his point of view across. I also think that Justice Thomas is far smarter than people give him credit for.
Oh, I'm having a shot at him for his behavior, but I mean, it was a very contentious confirmation, but
Right,
he wouldn't have got to first base if he'd been an incompetent judge.
Right,
He's
right.
hardly.
Right.
I think he has some extreme positions, and the black community can't be too happy on his comments on affirmative action and that. I think he's got a chip on his shoulder.
Right.
But no, he's a very competent, and I've heard him give commencement addresses, and he knows what he's talking about.
In terms of the court, I think, that 5-4 dynamic sort of has remained in place even, since Justice Scalia's untimely departure. Now we're waiting to see what happens with, President Trump's appointment. We are facing a situation where the 5-4 split will become hardened because, the person who has been appointed may be more, to the right than the former justice who just departed. So, we'll see what happens. It's hard to tell where the court will go,
It's
with
always
the new
hard.
appointment. Yeah.
Like, that's really my point. No matter who stacked it, they don't, in every case, follow those expectations.
Right.
And I put it down to a very good thing, regardless of the bias of those who put them on, and regardless even sometimes of the judges or the justices' bias. When it comes down to it, I think, at least in my lifetime, they take it very seriously and follow the law as they honestly see it.
I think the key will be Justice Ginsburg. I saw a recent video online where she was working out with her personal trainer. And I think everyone was cheering on that trainer. It's important for him to keep her alive. Because if she does retire from the court, then you will see a real shift in power where the president will be able to appoint another conservative justice, and you'll have a 6-3 majority that will be able to, do some significant damage.
Well, none of us know the future, but I think the statistical probability of her leaving one way or another, and such an appointment is almost certain.
Right. It's a real possibility. We just don't know what will happen.
So it's a brave new world with the Supreme Court.
Right.
But, there's a little bit more than the Supreme Court going on in the US. And let's just take a huge development where the courts got involved again on this so-called Muslim ban.
Right.
The ban on people coming from other countries in the Islamic world, which I think it could have been expressed that way, but the president foolishly said it up front that he was trying to stop Muslims, and of course the court seized on that. How does that bear on religious freedom or a narrowing of religious tolerance and practical freedoms?
Well, I think clearly Muslims are being targeted. It's a real political issue. Since 9/11, Americans are very afraid of another attack. And the president is aware of that, and I think is using that issue as a wedge issue to distinguish himself from the other party, and trying to build a base who will support him and his agenda. And I think in politics, if you can create that wedge issue, you can use it and capitalize on it to your political advantage. And I think that's what's happening. Clearly, I am not in any I'm not in the government, so I don't know what the real threat is. I'm speculating from the outside, but I don't think the threat is as serious as being projected.
No, I agree with you.
All right.
I mean, on one level, I think radical Islam has been awakened all over the world. That's real. I mean, ISIS is Exhibit A.
Right, right.
But as far as any existential or even daily practical threat to the U.S., very minimal.
Right.
And what does exist can be handled as police actions.
Right.
But we've had the laws almost, the whole structure of law enforcement changed from end to end. You don't have to just fly. I mean, there it's in your face constantly, the whole procedure. But it's paranoia writ large.
Right.
And to me, the parallel is, and I've never heard anyone make this, but it's sort of the parallel in regular law enforcement and punishing crimes to then throwing in hate crimes legislation, which sort of adds an extra unnecessary. It's always been illegal to act violently toward another person
Right.
And the law always, when you're brought up on murder, it looks at your motive, doesn't it?
Right.
If there's no motive, it's accidental harm done. It could be manslaughter.
You know,
but first degree or you know, with malice and so on would get a greater penalty. But we're thrown in that law. Terrorism would always be wrong. There's law enforcement, the military outside the country, within the police can deal with it. But we've so panicked that we've restructured in many quite troublesome ways our system to accommodate this perceived threat.
Right.
And now it's writ large on how we deal with other countries.
And I think this whole Muslim ban is also tied into the immigration issue, which is also has been a hot button political topic in this country. And I think, you know, this is just building a political base rather than getting to a solution. I mean, we've been talking about these issues for quite some time. You've had politicians from both parties who have tried to come up with a common sense solution to our immigration issues, and what happens is, you know, within the parties, the extremes kind of pull people apart, and they keep this issue going because they benefit from it financially as well as politically.
Now, President Trump has done many good things. I'm not wanting to make a case that I'm down on everything he does. It's not good. He wouldn't appreciate it if he watched this program. I hope you're watching President Trump. Sounds like a call out to Putin, doesn't it?
Right.
But facetiously, I think President Trump went to Saudi Arabia early on, and that speaks less about him than about the US's crazy alliances that haven't served us well. But maybe he should go on a trip to China and go up and see the Great Wall.
Right.
The story of walls is not a successful one. You know, there's Hadrian's Wall in England, Great Wall of China, and a wall of sorts. There was the Maginot Line, followed World War I, that in all cases, the barbarians either went around them or came through the gate. It's not a solution, but as you say, it's a political weapon.
Right, but it speaks to
signals something.
It speaks to the fear that we have as citizens. A lot of people are afraid of what's happening in the country and changes. They are afraid of the melting pot. You know, they're looking at as themselves losing rights while others are gaining them. And, you know, unfortunately, we see politicians taking advantage of that fear and putting in place policies that will not benefit the country in the long term.
And politicians have had that tendency from time immemorial, but I'll tell you, when I date the beginning of a misuse in the U.S., it's the Willie Horton ad, remember? Right. The malicious sort of fear-mongering stuff that not only gained a political advantage, but produced a direct harm to the social situation. And I have I've told you in another regard, I have no time for someone to gain advantage will harm the system that you're working in. And you know, Adolf Hitler, I'm always quoting him because I study a lot of words. You know, he was so fixated on getting his own way, he actually at the end came to blame the German people for his failings. You're not worthy of my plan, you know. I mean, such a person should never have ruled there, and we don't want, what we really need, maybe it's a long way of coming at it, I think there's a great want in the world at large, and in the US since we're talking about it, for statesmen, people that, sure, they have ego in that, but they're wanting the best for the country, and I think both parties at the moment are forgetting that aspect.
You know, I simply think that, you know, this nation is at its best when we are able to engage in debate. We're able to talk issues through. Whether we agree or not, we should support, you know, the rights of citizens to debate issues and to discuss them in a very vigorous way.
It's recorded that Jesus' disciples came to him, I'm sure on more than one occasion, and they said, "Tell us, when will these things be?" It's a natural question. And Jesus gave quite a long answer, a litany of last day events. Might as well be the headlines for today. But he says the end is not yet, because before the end comes, there needs to be a great persecution. There needs to be a great falling away. There needs to be every man against his brother. A total meltdown and a total revelation of God's character. It's worth keeping that in mind as we live through these cataclysmic 21st century events. I think it's arguably 1 minute to midnight. But time is with the Lord, and how long that minute truly lasts, we will yet see. But let's make it our business to make sure that God is truly with us and that we are inspired by His Spirit and strengthened to endure those days, otherwise through which no flesh will survive. This is Lincoln Steed for Liberty Insider.